All right. So, hi everyone in this room, as well as everyone who's looking at it in posterity. I will begin. I'm the chair of this panel, and I should explain what we're doing. This is an author meets critics panel, and we are super happy today to be discussing a fantastic new book by Erin Mayo Adam. This is the book. The full title is Queer Alliances, How Power Shapes Political Movement Formation. It's a 2020 publication, Stanford University Press, and we're super happy that Erin's with us today. And okay, so the way this is going to work is I'll first introduce myself, then I will introduce the panelists, the critics, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. And then finally, I'll introduce Erin herself. So my name is Cyril Ghosh. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at Wagner College in Staten Island, New York. We have today with us panelists, Howell Williams, Assistant Professor, Western Connecticut State University, who will go first. Howell will be followed by Lisa Beard, Assistant Professor, Western Washington University. And finally, we have Charmaine Willis, Charmaine, Adjunct Assistant Professor, University of Maine, and PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science, University of Albany, State University of New York. And last but definitely not the least, the author of the book, Erin Mayo Adam, Assistant Professor, Hunter College, CUNY, City University, New York, right? All right, so what we'll do is we're going to start with you, Howell, and each of you should speak for about 15 minutes, and less is fine, but please try not to go over. Like, I'll put in the chat saying that, oh, your time's up. and then once you all are done, then Erin can take over. And when Erin's done, we'll open it up for Q&A, okay? All right, very good. So Howell, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks to all the panelists for being here, and especially thanks to Erin for writing this book. I have a number of sort of ideas, threads, kind of, I don't have a kind of overarching set of comments, but I do have a number of sort of discrete things that that Erin's book has me thinking about more deeply. So I think Queer Alliances makes a number of really important contributions to the literature on movements and social movements, political movements. I'm especially attracted to this book's focus on discourse and ideas about what movement actors think about when they think about rights and the concept of rights, and pushing us to appreciate rights as movement actors understand them, which I think is a really important intervention. There's a really great discussion in the book about how movement actors identify the law, for example, as a network of sites and processes, and in ways that I think scholarship, our efforts to make the functions of the state legible in an academic way render the ways that we understand concepts like rights and the law completely different than the way that movement actors understand these concepts. And so I think the book for that alone is a really important intervention. Erin has us think more about the concept that she develops through the book of rights episodes as elements of the political opportunity structures that condition movement possibilities. And I think this is also a really important development. The notion of rights episodes breaks with linear notions of progress to identify how short blasts of activity can dramatically shape movement activity and cohesion. And there's this great conversation about, this sort of neutron star, or these really sort of evocative images that come out through the interviews, which I really liked. The Notion of Rights episodes is about identifying and delineating creative versus defensive rights episodes, and having us think about the ways that these structure movement possibilities, which I think is really useful. Queer Alliances also pushes us to measure the success of movements not in the types of rights that they secure for their members, but instead in movements' capacity to adapt and expand into new areas of struggle. So I think obviously the book has a lot to offer for political scientists interested in social movements, or scholars across the academy interested in social movements. But I also thought there were a number of other places where this would be a really good teaching book. I think it's an excellent example of how to do qualitative methods well in social science research. So there's an excellent description of the methods undertaken. It's worth the price of the book for the appendices alone, where Aaron goes through the sort of methodological considerations that went into the project. And another thing, and I really want to thank you for this, I think this is a great book for state and local government, which is not something that when I teach state and local, I never teach about social movements, which I feel like your book has made me feel really bad about that. Like, obviously, social movements are such a key player in state and local government, and I don't know how others teach this subject, but I don't know if that's a sort of robust corner of state and local government education. So I think that that's another really important way. An element of the book forces us to focus on how family operates in the gay marriage debate. Aaron shows how the push for marriage equality sought to normalize gay and lesbian couples in the eyes of the public. There's some really good examples in the book, sort of visual examples as well. And I thought this was connected well with the book. It might have come out last year or the year before by Joe Neal Rollins, called Legally Straight, which is about the sort of legal construction of gay and lesbian couples as sort of presenting them as legally straight. So I thought there was some really good parallels there. And of course, the right to marry has been a long foe of more radical queer politics. I'm thinking here of Andrew Sullivan and sort of the debates in the 1990s about moving from sexual liberty to civilized commitment, which is the title of the 1996 book by William Eskridge. I apologize for bringing up Andrew Sullivan in a queer politics panel, but it sort of needs to be said that this is a long simmering debate in queer politics. And queer activists and scholars have said for decades that the push to marry collapses the LGBTQ coalition into narrow gay rights battles. But I think what's really important about Aaron's book is that the debate as it's existed for the most part has tended to focus on normative terms about what a queer politics should look like. And I think Queer Alliances makes a more meaningful critique of the right to marry folks by focusing on the perceptions of the interviewees that you engaged with. The section of the book where you really get into how family frames, collapse the possibilities of a more progressive political possibilities, I think really shows how the right to marry push abandoned the coalition partners that had made that, that were sort of part of that political moment. And I think this is really important, took resources away from other causes. And so one of the things I'm really curious to hear you say more about, perhaps, is that sort of along these lines of not only just changing the frame of the debate, but also about taking away resources, you seem to argue in the book that marriage equality successes hollowed out the LGBTQ coalition in Washington state. And this is a quote from the book on page 144. The marriage equality rights episode in Washington state both encompassed a movement advance and complicated the political environment in ways that exacerbated harms experienced by marginalized communities within the movement. Now, this might be a stretch, what I'm about to say, but this observation has me thinking that maybe we should situate the recent rise of anti-trans legislation happening in states around the country as a potential ramification of the success of marriage equality, which I think is you don't claim that in the book, but I'm sort of trying to read between the lines of the way that you conclude the book. And I think we could make some really important conceptual connections between the kind of hollowing out of LGBTQ politics and the rise that we're seeing of a kind of virulent anti-trans legislation at the state level. Connecting this work to the way to some of the stuff that I think about or that I'm interested in, I wanted to just say a little bit about the ways I think the theories that you develop might help us understand conservative political movements. I think this book has a lot to offer those who study movements of all kinds, and I think that that's a sign of good social movement scholarship, I think, is that it is applicable to a wide range of ideological movements. I'm not a scholar of social movements necessarily, but the book that but Queer Alliances did have me thinking through the sort of rights episodes that have conditioned movement formation in the movements that I encounter in my research on fatherhood and American political development. Specifically, I was thinking about men's rights activism in the 1990s as I was reading Queer Alliances. And so the men's rights movements demonstrate many of the features, I think, of the movements that we see in Queer Alliances. Men's rights activism, especially in the 1990s, featured coalitions of diverse groups joining together to promote issues affecting men writ large. But differently situated groups focused on different issues, including poverty, suicide among men, opposition to feminism, promotion of more fair child custody arrangements. There's a long list of policy issues there. There's also an interesting phenomenon of women's groups that support men's rights. This is sort of its latest iteration is called Honey Badgers, but anyway, it's a complex movement of groups, right? And these diverse groups seek different claims, and their solidarity is fragile and fractured along lines that replicate power in the larger world, just as Aaron's book would predict. So Black men's rights organizations have some similar orientations to predominantly white groups, but their interests are not always represented by the larger coalition. Some overlap, such as things like personal responsibility, but there are also really important differences, such as emphasizing economic revitalization, which places, Black men's rights organizations at odds with sort of small government ideology of more predominantly white men's rights organizations. And so this is, I think, a fissure that your book does a really good job of helping us think through productively. But other contemporary conservative movements seem to coalesce around different arrangements of power and identity. And I think that my vision here is clouded a little bit by the Trump years that have made discerning specificity within the conservative movement more challenging from an outside perspective. I'm not doing the social work, the social movement participant observation of these movements that you have done for this book. But I do think that evaluating the power dynamics within conservative movements requires approaching with a somewhat different analytical lens. Power structures conservative movement coalitions, but the proximity to power is different for example, a white middle-class evangelical anti-abortion movement than for the undocumented immigrants in Arizona that form part of your book. So my point is not that rights episodes doesn't apply to movements on the right. As I said, I think it does. But I think that they might look different. I think the types of rights claims look different for movements on the right, for conservative movements. I think whiteness here is a really important sort of coalescing force for a lot of conservative social movements, especially today. Roger Smith and Desmond King have written about the rise of kind of white protectionism in American conservatism. So I think the rights injuries sustained by the groups that are in your book, Aaron, are real and are tangible. I think that some of the social movements that we see on the right today, especially these kind of white protectionist social movements, might be confronting perceived status injuries that are provoked by defensive rights episodes. So I'm just thinking that, like, what do we do with this idea of perception of rights injuries rather than actual rights injuries, like many of the people that you interviewed for your project? And how do we conceptualize perceived rights injuries? Again, and I don't expect a response on that, but I just think the book just has me thinking about how the notion of rights and the orientation towards rights for conservative movements might look a little bit different. So I think, just to conclude, that an important area, to apply the insights from Aaron's book moving forward might be in applying the concept of rights episodes as elements of political opportunity structures for conservative political movements as well, with the understanding that the conception of rights within that kind of movement ecosystem might be somewhat different. And that's all I have.
All right, Hal, thanks very much. You came in at, I want to say, 11 and 13 minutes, yeah? So that's fantastic. So next we have Lisa Beard. We're going to start whenever you're ready, Lisa, we can start. Okay.
Thank you. All right, well, I want to thank Cyril for all your work coordinating, and thank you to the co-panelists. It's an honor to be invited to reflect upon and celebrate the publication of this book, Queer Alliances. So in my brief comments today, I want to talk about some of the contributions I see the book making to the study of political movements and to LGBTQ immigration and race politics and to political science more broadly. So in Queer Alliances, Erin Mayo Adam examines how political movement coalitions unite and fracture around rights-focused campaigns. What factors are at play in the expansion and contraction of movements? Mayo Adam answers this question through a study of LGBTQ and immigrant rights movement formation in Washington State and Arizona. Her research is grounded methodologically in extensive interviews and participant observation, and framed historically in the political and legal history of each state, including its intersections with national politics. At the start of the project, we're introduced to her conceptualization of rights episodes, intense rights-based advocacy moments. This concept or framework of rights episodes emerges richly from the grounds of the study, including through the interviews themselves and the organizers' accounts of the intensities and explosions of these political moments, which some participants described through metaphors that trade in themes of thermodynamics, weather and stars, from wildfires to vortexes to explosions. Chapter 1 then theorizes how rights episodes impact political movement formation and shows in the case of the Referendum 74 campaign in Washington State, how movement groups are not sitting in a vacuum, planning their choice of offensive tactics for the next few decades, like legal or other political tactics in some kind of independent space, but are in fact deeply enmeshed in and responding to a political landscape that's filled with threats, the shape of whom, partly known, but also unpredictable in their manifestation, as well as other kinds of opportunities that are really unpredictable and out of their control. Chapter 2 examines the passage of and fights against Arizona's SB 1070 as a defensive rights episode that, quote, activated a generation, and which through the very extensive work on the part of immigrant and queer and trans movement organizations was met with the formation of a quite expansive coalition. Chapter 3 synthesizes the findings of the Washington and Arizona cases to theorize how coalitions unite and fracture, and maps the ways in which movement actors construct narratives of a shared past in order to articulate the ways in which seemingly discrete movement sectors are in fact deeply bound together in their accounts. Their stories, Mayo Adam explains, work to expand movement parameters, to enable new relationships, and to build coalitions. Chapter 4 identifies and theorizes the critical role of certain organizers whom Mayo Adam calls intersectional translators in political movement expansions, tracing how, for example, they invoke their own identity as situated across and bridging movement sectors that had been constructed as discrete, and in so doing articulating those issue areas or movement sectors as being bound together. The conclusion brings the book's findings and frameworks to bear on a series of additional sites and outlines specific recommendations for how movement actors can minimize coalition fragmentation and build expansive political movements. So I first want to reflect on Mayo Adam's descriptive account of political movements and the context in which they form and fracture. One of my favorite things about this book is how it documents and theorizes political movement landscapes in all of their messiness. The book doesn't attempt to rein this messiness into some kind of false closure, but leans into it descriptively, theoretically, and analytically. Mayo Adam takes as the ground of her theory this landscape with all of its contingencies, tensions, impasses, victories, apparent failures. We are given an account of the multitude of historical and political forces at play in creating movement openings and closures. It's a very deeply textured account. She shows us how political movement struggles are, quote, unstable, hydra-like creatures, end quote. I love that. I'm using that in the future. That coalesce and divide as they attempt to be responsive to their contexts. They are, quote, dynamic series of shifting coalitions, end quote, not a monolithic body. As a part of this descriptive account, Mayo Adams' book paints for us the ways in which political movements are constituted by a range of different kinds and statuses of political organizations that come into and out of formation and into and out of coalition. Mayo Adam explains that when scholars of political movements focus on a few well-funded national organizations, the story and therefore our understanding is deeply curtailed. So much of the actual politics, so much of the action, what constitutes political movements, is cited far off of that map. In the particular stories in this book, so many of the possibilities for coalition came into being in and between movement organizations that don't make the glossy pages of national news and don't have the most well-funded profiles. Ultimately, the book makes clear the critical importance of accounting for these multiple scales and forms of movement organizations that together constitute larger political movements. Also, as a part of this textured and complicated movement landscape, Mayo Adam traces, we also find an important account of the ways in which LGBTQ and immigrant rights movement campaigns exist in relationship to organizing and legal strategies, not only from the liberal center or the liberal left, but also from the right and the far right, as has been named. There's much to learn in this book about this area. In the archive of the failures of, one thing that stood out to me is the way in which some of the archives of the failures of the right were a really important part of the story, the way that early bills in Arizona were, quote, like laughed off the floor. And yet those groups adapted and shifted tactics over time and sought to make their particular anti-immigrant and anti-LGBTQ politics part of the mainstream. Mayo Adams' book then sheds light on the ways in which queer and trans immigrant rights political movements form and reform in antagonistic relationship to opponents and counter movements that dictates what choices are available for these advocates. I think this is just so critical for work on LGBTQ and immigrant rights politics, and something that needs more reckoning with in the field. So I really appreciate this aspect of the book. And then I'd like to comment on Mayo Adams' methodological approach. Queer Alliances contributes to an ethnographic turn in political science. It's through centering extensive interviews with organizers together with participant observation that Mayo Adam is able to bear witness to and theorize the ways in which at the heart of organizing work is so much interpretive work, like bids and calls in which organizers are calling out to try to convince people this is how you should understand what this movement project is or who you belong to. And that the life of political movements are replete with failures and fractions and coalescing that can't be registered at an oversimplified national level. Also, this ethnographic approach helps us account for the ways in which political organizers themselves understand the political landscape in which they contest power and build power. Also in this book, particularly in the appendix, Mayo Adam offers a roadmap of political principles that guide her research, from thinking through the implications of her positionality to the legacies of extractive academic research. She describes her own commitment to volunteer work within the movements as a contribution that seeks to address and shift that fraught history. And finally, regarding approach, I'm struck by how the book takes on these very contemporary cases or recent cases and movement formations in a way that also situates them so carefully in their legal and political history. So Mayo Adams so carefully sets up actually very expansive and far-reaching legal, political, economic, and organizing history of each state. I also see the book contributing to scholarship on political identity, especially in its work tracing how shared narratives are constructed. So in my own work on political identification, I am preoccupied by political struggles over how people come to understand who they are and what their interests are and what politics they're beholden to. So it was especially fascinating to read about the multiple discursive strategies employed by organizers to summon people into a we, and to narrate the way that seemingly discrete movements are in fact should be understood as co-constituted, whether by civil rights history or organizing history, or how different members' identities themselves form a bridge. So I have two final comments, just short questions that arise for me as I read Queer Alliances. One is how, Erin, how you see studies of political movements and social movements in relationship with each other between the fields that you were drawing on in your research, including between political science and sociology. I'm wondering if you can comment at all, if you'd like, on your use of the term political movements rather than social movements, and what it does to claim them as political movements, or what it means to do this work in political science. I'm genuinely interested as someone who also studies political movements, and they're often tagged as social movements, and there's just a conversation around that. Some accounts in the project are also the other question is around how some accounts in the project are clearly transactional coalitions. You can hear in the organizers' accounts like how they're convincing other people in the organization to do a certain thing, like this will benefit us for this reason, da 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 da. But at other moments when organizers are actually, for example, articulating through their identity, the ways in which different movement sectors are in fact deeply bound together, or different political issues or justice issues. At some points I wonder, is it even a coalition at that point? Like, does the concept or language of coalition at some point kind of fall away or limit what we're able to see in certain moments of political coherence or synthesis that you're marking and tracking? Are there places where it's being called a coalition, but there's actually something deeper that your account is tracing there? So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for this book, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Lisa. And you came in at 12 minutes. So yeah, all right, very good. We're now moving on to Charmaine, and whenever you're ready, yeah.
Great. So thanks everyone for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about this work. I will say that when I was initially approached, I was excited to read the book. It seemed really interesting and a topic that I want to know more about. But as I started reading it, I thought, you are speaking my language. I study social movements, so there were so many parallels I saw to what Dr. Mayo Adam mentioned in their work, to what I study as well, social movements in general. So that was really exciting for me. And when I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, this is what this is. This is what this is. So it was great. I really enjoyed it. So in this work, of course, the key kind of research questions we have here are broadly, what factors contribute to political movement formation? And then also what factors limit movement expansion? And as others have mentioned, these questions are explored through case studies of rights coalitions in Washington and Arizona. And as someone who studies social movements, one of the things that I really loved about this book was that it really serves as a reminder that, and I think Lisa mentioned about political versus social movements, definitely something I would be interested in hearing your take on, Erin. But here, the reminder that, movements, political, social, otherwise, are not unified. There's always heterogeneity, and that there can come with a cost for that. So what happens, or what does this look like? As we know, coalitions are composed of a variety of different organizations. What this means in practice, of course, is that these organizations have different goals, different priorities, and perhaps more importantly, different identities. So even when we have these organizations that are part of the coalition that's, incorporating them in a same general area, there's costs and benefits to creating that coalition. in terms of the contribution of the book, so really it addresses why and how to form alliances across different organizations. And I think, again, one of the innovations here that I really liked is talking about both mainstream organizations and marginalized ones. And I think regardless of what issue you're talking about, what area of organizing or social movements that you're talking about, that's a common pattern. So I think that can really speak to a lot of different areas of research. So in terms of the why we might see alliances form across different organizations, as the book suggests, we see this creation of coalitions, in some sense because we have sharing of resources. We might have, strength in numbers in the sense that we can pressure the government perhaps more to get, the claims that we want met or realize our goals. We can, of course, also share strategies. In terms of the how, something that Lisa mentioned and I really loved about the book is really having these intersectional translators, which I think obviously applies in this case, but I think also applies to other coalitions and other social movements as well. So essentially here, these intersectional translators, people who belong to different communities who experience perhaps similar struggles, perhaps have similar adversaries. And I think the really powerful thing about including those types of people, generally when we think about social movements, but certainly in this work, it speaks to this idea of agency and the fact that these connections between groups that may have different identities, maybe different communities, but it speaks to the fact that someone has to actively bridge these different communities and identities and show people that there are similar experiences. I really liked in that kind of lens the example of the shared experience of coming out with both the LGBTQ plus and the undocumented migrant communities, and the fact that this is something that they both kind of deal with. And then also was mentioned in terms of creating kind of a shared identity, this establishment that they all have similar threats. So sort of this rationale that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Something else that I personally really appreciate too is this idea of variation. I think it's nice to see kind of this focus on both these, as Lisa was mentioning, these movements, these organizations that get a lot of media attention, and then also ones that don't. And of course, when you focus on the ones that are more highly covered, we're missing part of the story there. So I really appreciated that about the book as well. But as I mentioned, I think one of the really key things that the book hits home, not just thinking about these particular communities and issues, but also just for understanding social movements, is that, again, coalitions are fragile, they're superficial in some cases, and certainly there's a lot of different interests and different identities. A couple, I took actually a lot of quotes from the book because I thought so many of them really excellent. One of the quotes along this lines in terms of the coalition building from page 14, coalition building across and within movements is a difficult and delicate process in practice, especially in contexts where the multiplicity of organizations that represent minority communities are rivals with one another when it comes to fundraising and grant applications. So this was a key point that was mentioned in the book, this idea that, in some sense, these organizations are competing with one another, especially when we have these mainstream ones that tend to get more funding from national organizations, what was referred to by some of the interviewees as the nonprofit industrial complex, and then the marginalized organizations not receiving quite as much attention or funding. Another reason that we see in the book for the coalitions being fragile and perhaps splitting at some point is just this idea of tokenization of these marginalized groups by mainstream groups. So a great quote about this on page 107, mainstream groups invite the participation of marginalized community members without placing them in leadership roles or broadly tackling issues that disproportionately impact these individuals, such as immigration detention, economic security, and healthcare. There was also mentioned that in some cases, this kind of tokenization kind of pushed some people to stop being involved with the mainstream organization and even the coalition as well. And in terms of what the tokenization might look like, this idea of having, for example, was given an advisory board with this coalition where there was, one person that had kind of this intersectional identity and saying that we have this marginalized community represented here. And then also in terms of fragility of the coalition, this idea of issue fracture, which again, I think this is one of the really big points, is just this idea that even though organizations might be part of the same kind of general issue area, they might have the same broad goals. At the same time, they might have different priorities. So this idea was mentioned a couple of times where we might have a prioritization of marriage equality, especially among the mainstream LGBTQ groups, versus, for example, more marginalized LGBTQ plus groups getting the Sheriff Arpaio out of Arizona. That was one of the examples in the book. And then also related to that, just generally different views on policies. So as was mentioned, marginalized groups are hurt by this exclusive form of coalition building that leaves forgotten the issues that matter to those communities. And then just to reiterate a couple of things that was mentioned already. So as someone, again, who not only studies social movements, but also someone who, like right now, I'm doing my dissertation, I'm doing field work, I'm doing qualitative research methods. The methodology was really transparent. I really appreciated that. I like that you have the interview protocols in the back. So if I was, for example, grad student learning qualitative methods for the first time, or even now, it's really nice to have kind of the questions laid out, how you ask this. And then also, as Lisa was mentioning, this idea of really thinking about yourself and position with your fieldwork, with the people you're researching, the people you interview. That's something that's really not covered, in my opinion, very well in a lot of methods training, especially qualitative methods. So having that kind of reflection in the book, I think, as Howell mentioned, would make it a really nice teaching tool in terms of just learning the methodology. One thing that I was wondering about the book, again, thinking about this from like kind of the social movement perspective. So just wondering what the role of the public is in terms of things like alliance formation or strategic choices, like the choice of narratives. How do these coalitions, choose narratives when they have so many different priorities and policies? How do they choose tactics? And I think this is an important consideration in the sense that, they may not be trying to mobilize protesters, but certainly they're trying to get some kind of public support in some form. It might be funding, but it might also be thinking about how to potentially get public support in terms of the ballot box when people actually go to vote on these issues. So one thing that I've seen in my research that I also think relates to this, but I think it was also in the book as well, is this idea of kind of a trade-off in terms of public support between broadening the coalition. There's, as I was mentioning, a lot of reasons for that in terms of pooling resources, et cetera. But then also potentially alienating members, not only of the marginalized groups, organizations, but also people that may support the group as well. Sometimes there is a trade-off between maintaining the marginalized group's goals, their priorities, their identity. And then, so I guess just related to that, I was wondering, what do supporters of the marginalized organizations think of the coalition? Are they okay with having this really broad coalition with mainstream organizations? Or is that kind of alienating for them and perhaps too distant from their experiences to really have them wanting to continue supporting the coalition? So that is actually all I have, but I'm really looking forward to talking about this with all of you.
I mean, thanks. We're at 3:40, about 12 minutes. So everyone's like, exactly right. Yeah. So Erin, that frees you up a little bit, I think, to go a little bit over 15 minutes. So whenever you're ready, we'll have you speak. And then, oh, before we do that though, we should probably do an electronic round of applause for our critics, right? Can we do that, please? Here it is. All right. Thank you all. And Erin, whenever you're ready.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming together and for reading my book and talking about it. I can't tell you how just thrilled I am to be in a space where people are just so just such wonderful things to say about it. And I'm still shocked that it came together to this day. So I don't think I'm ever going to get over that shock. Um, it was a very difficult process. I mean, it it's I think unusual for this type of a book to be a first book that comes out of a dissertation because there's so much pressure to make sure your work is speaking to other scholars and that you're very methodologically sound. I remember when I was in graduate school, there was this huge emphasis on you have to get more interviews, more interviews. And then I was sitting there, I'm like, well, now they're just saying the same thing over and over again. So it feels like I'm just running in circles to appease future interviewees on the job market who aren't even in my methodological area. Um, but so even getting it coming together was great. And so I just want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to talk about it and your schedules that I'm sure are really busy right now to read it. Yeah, the book really came about because of my experiences with the Prop 8 campaign in California before I entered graduate school. I lived in a very conservative town, and marriage was all you used to talk about LGBTQ issues. And then when I went to Washington State, I was more immersed in the immigrant rights community. And the Referendum 74 campaign came about, and it seemed as if the ways in which the groups aligned differed quite a bit in Washington than they had in California. And the stories that people were telling to the press were of this rosy coalitions coming together. So I wanted to do a book that told this great story of different people coming together and forming these powerful coalitions that win huge achievements. But that isn't what anyone told me in the interviews. That was the opposite of what I heard, in fact. So then it became a much different project. And especially as I was involved with my own volunteer work, I saw the various ways in which things fractured, but also set up future struggles. So I guess what I'll go through people's comments. And I'll begin with Howell's excellent point about um, whether or not. So you talked about how in the book, which is so great, and how I say in the book and my analysis of my research, that the successes hollowed out the coalition in Washington State, and maybe we should situate the rise of anti-trans issues as a ramification of marriage equality. I think you can do that, and I think that the Washington State case is a good example of why after marriage equality happened, the resources from all of the mainstream organizations were sapped. Many people left. Um, People went to different states. They just sort of left the movement altogether. And when at the end of my research in 2016, that's when we started seeing the rise of the anti-trans bathroom bills. There were several that emerged in Washington State, and when that started occurring, it was pretty clearly backlash to marriage equality. Um, and at the time, I was doing most of my volunteer work with the trans community in Washington State. And within that community, there was a lot of concern over internet attacks, media attacks on trans people in Washington. And it was to the degree where there was increases to calls to suicide hotlines. There was actually, I think, one or two fairly low profile but high profile for the trans community suicides that actually occurred. And the response overwhelmingly was, it's true, these bills likely have no opportunity to pass in Washington State, which is a predominantly liberal state, at least legislatively speaking. But we should do something to combat these in order to show the community that they're supported. And when we went to the legislature and spoke with big partners about it, the overwhelming consensus was you should ignore this. It's just going to go away. It's not going to be a big issue in a couple of weeks, which of course never happened. And then it became just a bigger and bigger issue until, um, as more opportunities presented themselves to conservative organizations, until we're at the point we are today, where we're seeing a lot of bills actually get passed at the state and local level, not in states like Washington, but in other states, because attacks like this reverberate across the United States, right? So I do think we can connect this back to the success of marriage equality, but not only the success of marriage equality, but the ways in which power hierarchies sort of dictate how the coalition fractured in the aftermath, right? And how power was centered within the coalition in Washington State at the time. So I thought that was a really great point. I also liked how you thought about comparing my theories to conservative movements. I think that that's true, but I think you're absolutely right. We have to think about rights differently because of the different proximity to power. Certainly, I think maybe some useful frameworks would be thinking of, oh shoot, I'm forgetting the term, but there's a way Jeff Dudas thinks about this in an article that he wrote years ago with special rights framing, where it essentially talks about not adapting, but like taking away the frames of others, right? And making it your own frame to try to piggyback off of it. I don't necessarily like the frames language as much because I feel like you get too trapped in it, right? When in fact, how we think about rights can move beyond a particular frame within a moment in time, in addition to other reasons. But I think that might be useful. It might be more that they're trying to figure out ways to limit the space that the discourse is taking up, right? That might be one way of thinking about it. But I think that was an excellent point. And then to Lisa's comments, um, I really like the question, how why did I settle on the term political movements? I actually had a huge debate about about this in the background. Um, and before the book was published, I went through the book and made sure that political replaced everywhere that social appeared in the book. And the main reason was because I like the way the term political is evocative of power in a way that social is not. And since I've been teaching Introduction to American Government like a million times since in my new job, I have all these different uh, th- um, definitions of politics, and I just pulled one up. This is from Theodore Lowy, and it's one I like a lot because it's cynical, and I think I'm somewhat cynical. Where Theodore Lowy says politics is the pursuit of power in order to dominate over others and to contest that domination, often through government. And I think that that's sort of how that's not entirely how I think of politics, right? But the way in which Lowy conceives of politics as connected to power is something I wanted to um, use in how I framed movements in the book. And not only Lowy, but others as well. I just pulled that up because I can pull up my Introduction to American Government slides very quickly. I want to, in the context of a panel conversation virtually. um, so so there's that. There's also and this is also sort of, I think, maybe getting into my future things I'm thinking about doing in the aftermath of the book. I don't really directly challenge political movement scholarship in the book. I say I conceive of rights episodes as sort of a variation of political opportunity structures. But I think what I'd like to do is to actually start contesting political movement theory a bit, which I'm a little bit nervous about because they're like the big wigs, right? Um, but um, the reason is because I think a lot of the theory and terminology they've created has sort of constructed political movements in ways that are not really representative of how they occur on the ground. So, for example, political opportunity structures, that's such a it's a very happy turn. It's an opportunity that arises that you can take advantage of, right? But they're very traumatic for people who are in the movement, right? The anti-trans bills, that's a rights episode, right? You have suicides happening alongside that, right? In Arizona with SB 1070, with that rights episode, you have huge increases in racial profiling, police abuses, et cetera, right? So I think that we need to sort of put more of the people and movements within our theories. And I think the rights episodes concept does that in a way that I don't think political opportunity structures does as well. And then I also chose political movements because I wanted to get away from the concept contentious politics. As I think some people are probably laughing at, because nobody who is a movement actor uses that term. So I have a real hard time with theorists coming in and creating terminology that isn't reflective of people on the ground and how they conceive of their relationship to politics and power, right? And I think that's important because that's how we make our work understandable beyond political science, right? That's how we can tell narratives that can bring in not only ourselves, but others. So like with my own work, I've written 2 articles for the Washington Post that relate my work to other movements. And I'm able to do that because I use terminology and I use frameworks that come from the actors themselves. Um, so that's, I guess I'm getting more passionate about it, but I feel like that's something that is coming. Maybe I'll be shot down really harshly in a panel in the future and I'll change my mind a bit about it. But that's sort of one of the things I was thinking about for the future. Um, let's see, other comments. Another thing Lisa brought up was the concept of coalitions. Is it sometimes missing something deeper? I use the concept of coalitions because I liked how um, I didn't have to be as definite with it, right? And I could then encompass the ways things fracture and break apart and these inter and inter-movement dynamics. But I think you're right that in doing that and relying on that so much, I don't think I got into enough about how that can be a limiting framework. And I think we're seeing a lot of scholarship come about now that's looking at ways in which coalitions themselves are limiting frameworks, right? Especially when we think of coalitions in these big mainstream campaigns that one of the interviews described them as like paper coalitions. Is that a real coalition, right? Or is that just a superficial alliance you've made for the moment? And I don't necessarily think that terminology always gets at that. So I think that's an excellent point to use to get to for future things. Sorry, my voice is going out because of my head cold. It's like the worst thing when you're an academic and you have to talk all the time. And then at least I'm virtual, I suppose. Um, and then Charmaine, thank you so much for your comments as well. I really like your question. What is the role of the public in terms of things like forming an alliance? I totally agree with your analysis and how you're looking at that question and this trade-off between public support and broadening coalitions or alienating members. I think that's very true. I think I would add to that is that trade-off is often given by mainstream groups to center them in the coalition as well. So you want to also think about ways in which the extent to which that's true and the extent to which that enables those in power to maintain power. At least it's hard to conceive them that way because elites within social movements at the local level, they're not elites still in terms of how we think of elites, right? But they certainly have more resources, right? So those along with those with resources to maintain resources. So I really like that question because I think you're definitely onto something with the trade-offs perspective. And then finally, you asked, what do supporters of marginalized groups think of the coalition? Are they okay with it? Often they hated the coalition, like they really did. I remember with one of my interviewees. I think it's in that I have multiple interviewees who were from marginalized organizations who were talking about marriage equality itself wholly as a bad experience that they had because of the ways in which power is centered. Other interviewees talked about it as in like, I participated in that. I'm never doing mainstream politics again. And then also people echoed that from within mainstream movements. They didn't like the extent to which it was alienating, usually people of color, but not always, which might be shocking to it wasn't always only the marginalized community that was articulating this, but people who were within the mainstream community who felt that their maybe their positions within the organization and the way that politics was being conducted in the state itself limited their ability to become more inclusive. And I think that's something we need to grapple with as we think about social movement politics going forward, because there's this trade-off that has to occur between saying what it is that you're going to be fighting for and defining yourself and then alienating others, right? And saying what you're not. And do we want to, we should be more careful about that because we should think about future struggles when we do that and ways in which that alienation might create future problems, like the rise of anti-trans legislation, right? Things that we can't always foresee. That was actually perfect because that was right where I was going to end. I'm at 15 minutes now. I finished all the comments. And I'm also like losing my voice, so I'll go ahead and end there. But thank you all.
Thank you, Erin. What we should do is we should open it up for like a general discussion, I think, at this point. But I do have a few things, and but I'm on another one of these in a few months with you. So I think I'll just not say all the things that I want to say, because also in the interest of time. But I do, well, first I want to flag that I think you actually do critique mainstream social movement theory. I don't think it's that it's that invisibilized.
I couldn't hide my disdain.
Yeah.
That was something that the early reviewers kept trying to say, so I kept trying to do that.
They were saying that you are doing it or you're not doing it enough, like sufficiently.
Well, more that, and I think this is also part of the process of becoming a scholar is to learn how to critique people in ways that don't necessarily bring them down, right? But to show ways in which you're adding, enhancing, and changing, right? So that was usually the angle the critique came from. But I think that also means that you're not as willing to call out things when they're wrong, right? So I felt like I was like sort of limited of that in the book, but it's good to hear that I couldn't hide it completely.
You did. Also, I'm not familiar with this problem of not saying openly what I disagree with. It's like I'm not at all like I'll just say I don't agree with this, and that's fine. I mean, one of the good things is, and among other things, there's the First Amendment and all the rest of it. So, but I have a question that is sort of a human question. Okay, I want you to speak a little bit maybe about what you would do slightly differently about the book if you went back, like suddenly you're in grad school and Charmaine's going to enjoy this, right? Like you're in grad school, you're thinking about doing this. Were there things that you've done post facto, you realize you're like, maybe, oh, I don't know, I could have done it slightly differently, but in terms of methodology, case selection, whatever, like, timing.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it felt like so much of what I did was just very constrained by what was happening. I think I would, if I were to do it differently, I would probably be a little bit clearer about the demographics of the individuals I was interviewing from the beginning. but I'm also, there's an extent to which I couldn't do that, especially in contexts like Washington, where there's a large white community and a much smaller community of color, because in that sort of context, when you're dealing with advocates and organizers, and when you put it with their language, it becomes clearer who it is you're talking about. But I do think I would have been clearer about that. I think from the beginning, one of the errors I made was when I was doing my IRB, initially I got an exemption because I was like, well, they're going to just talk about political things that they're engaged in. Um, so there's nothing they're going to discuss that they don't need to, that they would need to have made anonymous, right? That was totally wrong. All the interviews,
Oh, they're undocumented migrants.
yes. Well, not only, well, these were mostly leaders of organizations, so they were formally out as undocumented. So talking with me as wasn't something that was going to be a greater probability of endangering them to immigration, right? But in terms of what I didn't foresee was the ways in which they would talk about their relationship to others that might reflect badly on their position in the community and their organization. So I ended up making the whole thing confidential after those first few interviews, because I didn't want the study to harm movement actors, right? And I think that's also a reflection of sort of this naivete that we have as like political scientists, right? This idea of if you're talking about politics and how you're engaging with others, it's publicly, that it's something that's not um, that you. Why would you need to keep that confidential, right? But politics is about relationships, especially local politics. Everything is about relationships. And because of that, even those things that might not seem like they need to be confidential, there's ways in which they will need to be confidential. So um, I would have done that from the beginning. And when I went to CUNY and switched over my IRB, then the whole IRB became went through the full process. And this was all happening. Part of the reason that the methodology came out the way it did was because it was happening at the time that leaders at the Western Political Science Association, like Harrigan Schwartz Shea, Sam Magic, um, they were I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was they were fighting against these standards that were putting on journals. The cat has arrived to say hello to me. And so there were a lot of conversations at conferences happening around qualitative research methodology in a way it wasn't included. And my methodology was mostly formed through those conversations. So that's how that occurred. So if I could have done it differently, I suppose I would have met Peregrine Schwartz, Shea, and Sam Magic earlier, um, and then had a clear research study from the beginning versus having to superimpose it after I heard all of their brilliant interventions later on. Um, but I do think as political scientists, we need to pay greater attention to qualitative methodology, and it should be part of methodological sequences. It isn't right now. It wasn't at my institution. Um, and I do think political science suffers for that. And I think probably the best example of that is actually the 2020 election. A lot of the traditional methodological, the quantitative methodological techniques, they don't really tell us what happened in 2020. What tells us what happened, right, are the dynamics on the ground, things that you get from ethnographies, from qualitative research, from interpretive research. And I think we need to push more um, that what we say and our findings are important because they can help us understand the world in ways that quantitative methodology cannot. But that's not to say I am opposed to quantitative methodology. I co-author with quantitative scholars all the time. It's just that we also have something to add, and we should be fighting for that within political science.
And I feel very bad because your voice is it's yeah. Are you okay? You're fine, right?
Yes, it's fine. It's literally just my sinuses. I don't have any achiness or anything. It's just it's the the daycare head cold from Suki Daycare that all the parents are getting.
I mean, I'm happy to ask my questions of the other three. I'm perfectly happy to do that. If you just give me a signal and I'll do it. But if you don't mind, I'll move on. I have many more, but I'll just briefly ask you this. Were one of these groups slightly more open-minded than the other? Like one of these two groups, uh, like I know that it's hard to disaggregate them and decouple them into discrete blocks of like migrants slash immigrants and the queer slash LGBT plus people, like, but the sexual minorities as a phrase, for want of a better phrase, were they more open about working in coalition with immigration related groups, or was the reverse true, or was it all, was there a variance in the states? Like what's the story there?
I think the marginalized groups were more open, um, regardless of whether or not they were within the LGBTQ community or in the immigrant community. And I think the groups in Arizona were more open, which might seem counterintuitive, right? Because they haven't had as many successes.
So you explain that in the book, why that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. So I also do think that I do think those groups that were more closely connected to communities of color were much more open, especially, and this was an issue within the trans community in Washington State that would rise continually. So I do think that the experience of oppression is felt in such ways within that community. I think that it enables them to be more open to alliances that you have to work at a bit more. So I definitely think uh, sort of race and ethnicity can also be a way in which we see sort of this openness.
Right. I'm going to yield to the others now. So all of you who've been hamstrung by time constraints earlier, please jump in and ask other questions, respond to what Aaron's been saying, and so on and so forth.
I'm happy to start. So it's funny, Aaron, because initially I was going to say something about, well, if you had like this language about social movements like Tilly and Tarot and all this stuff, and to your point, I was, looking up their contentious politics book, and I was looking through, their process and mechanisms that they use, and I thought, this is so much jargon. I don't even think political scientists or like sociologists would even know what this means. And I think your point about, really trying to use the language of what these activists use or these leaders use is really important in social movement study. And yeah, your point about political opportunity structures, I have a lot of feelings about that. I totally agree with you. I think, honestly, I think it's a term that is really overused, and it doesn't really tell us too much about, what it actually means, what it looks like. There's not enough nuance there. So I completely agree. I'd love to talk more with you about social movements sometime.
Yeah, and it's a hard. It's just I think too jargony, and it tends to make it more sciencey, right? That's usually why it happens. But you don't have to have jargon to be sciencey, right? Um, or you can make your jargon at least make sense to others.
Totally agree.
Can I ask a question? I'm sort of echoing Cyril's. Sorry to ask questions with your voice, but I still have a couple of things that I kind of want to get a little bit more from you on. And I think it occurred to me when Lisa asked that really important question about sociology and political science, and where the two disciplines I think really meet is in a project like this. Noting at the outset that I'm ambivalent about the distinction between the two for the most part. But you say at the end that one of the ways that movements can achieve durability and can achieve a sort of inclusiveness to mount future campaigns is building institutions distinct from the political parties. And so I guess like feeling like this feels like a very political science-y kind of like what is it about party capture that is so particularly toxic for the types of the longevity that makes good movements? Because again, I think you're right. To one of the other ways I think you intervene in movement literature is to reframe how we think about successive movements. That achieving the goals that are set out in terms of rights wins is fairly narrow when we think about all of the other sort of possibilities that are shut off in achieving those wins. And so in order to achieve that longevity, one of the things you suggest is to basically avoid as much as you can working with mainstream political parties.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I think I never really have thought of it in terms of like what is toxic about it, but I think that's a really great way of thinking about that particular question. I mean, for one, they're locked to campaign cycles, right? And movement politics is to an extent locked to campaign cycles as well, but you always want them to be thinking beyond the campaign cycle, right? If you're going to form a grassroots network that's available to respond whenever an opportunity, an episode arises, right? And I don't necessarily think that thinking within cyclical campaigns presents that opportunity as well. Another problem with it is you want to be able to work with sort of different groups and different contexts as well, which might be different state contexts, but it could just be the different contexts of different items of legislation, right? And if you align yourself too closely with one political party, that will cut off your ability to potentially achieve advances or to thwart losses should the other political party take control. So it limits your ability to operate because then you get to be associated with like Democratic Party politics, right? That isn't to say that the actors themselves shouldn't be involved in party politics. It's just to say that I think it's important that these organizations, it's also forming a grassroots network that, I mean, these are identity politics things, right? Um, there is an extent, I guess there was this, okay, so this is a weird example, but I saw on Twitter today that there was somebody who wrote a article in the Orlando Sentinel about anger that Disney World has become so political right now that it's changing the Splash Mountain ride, right? Because it's now including it was this racist song of the South, and now they want to change it to whatchamacallit, Princess and the Frog, right? And that sort of made me think of this. Well, why are we constructing this as a political thing? These are people's identities, they're their lives, right? This is about including them within our larger world, right? It's not something that's connected necessarily to conservative and liberal politics. And I think that's something that a lot of the movement actors on the ground want to convey as well, right? They want to be treated as humans on their own, outside of the politics of the parties themselves, which I think is a very important thing in the sort of heightened political environment that we find ourselves in, right? Heightened partisanship environment we find ourselves in. I know that was a weird example, but it does sort of speak to the ways in which that this becomes weaponized in ways you might not think about, right? Um, it's also just it's it's a difficult thing though as well, especially in today's context where you have one of the political parties really operating so exclusively of different minority communities, right? Um, but when you're engaging in movement politics, you're trying to imagine new worlds, right? So you're trying to imagine a world where that isn't the reality, right? Where the reality is that you are included within the full spectrum of political parties. And so you operate as if that is the case, right? And that may then give you more possibilities for reaching that imagined world in the future, right? Um, hope that makes sense.
Mine is not a question, just a comment. It's already been spoken about a little bit, but I thought one of the like most chilling parts of the book was the account of the ways in which the funding dried up after marriage equality wins, and the ways in which people had been told, just wait, like we'll get marriage equality and then we'll come back for you. And that people found quite clearly there was no plan to do so, and no infrastructure to do that or vision to do that. And there was a resonance, a very strong resonance in that particular interview excerpt with an essay by Sylvia Rivera, or maybe an interview, but Queens in Exile, and she's writing about, let's see, so we've allowed them, so she's talking about the dominant lesbian and gay rights movement. So we've allowed them to speak for us so many damn years, and they've said to us, oh, let us pass our bill, then we'll come for you. Yeah, come for me 32 years later, and they're still coming for me. So there's like this resonance about the kind of that particular pattern in LGBTQ politics, maybe particularly, but maybe also in other places. So, but I really enjoyed the discussion, and it's really fun to get to straddle kind of these different, like to think about. I really appreciate the conversation about political movements too. It's really helping me, the language about it too.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm happy to, be fostering critique of that, I suppose.
Totally.
Yeah, it's definitely the language of will come for you next is it's it's very true of the LGBTQ community. I think also queer migrants would say that about the immigration community, with the way in which family is forefronted and ways that exclude LGBTQ people from the policies that are driven by immigrant rights organizations.
Yeah, I wonder, is it more, is the particular flavor specific to LGBTQ politics of a performance of like definitely coming back for you next, like, so, but then not actually doing it, as opposed to like not claiming, like there's some kind of promise made that's that seems to resonate in the LGBTQ.
Yeah. I do think that's how that one of the ways they get people to join groups, right, is with that promise. That you don't necessarily see as much within other communities. But I also think that there's just a lot of people who are just it's I had those 3 points, right, where of issue of ways coalitions fracture.
Yeah. At the end.
I just think there's a lot of people in the LGBTQ community that are not as committed to systemic change.
Yeah.
And that is not true with communities of color. With communities of color, you have a much larger group of people that are committed to systemic change. And I think that's just the crux of it. So when they win marriage, that's what they wanted, right?
Yeah.
So why should they continue? Versus when you are in an immigrant community, okay, let's say you've won Dreamers, now have a pathway to citizenship. Okay, but I still don't have access to healthcare, right?
Yeah.
I still am being policed to a larger degree. I'm still my members of my community are placed in detention centers, right? So the systemic change, their commitment is much stronger. And that I think pushes them to continue in ways the LGBTQ community hasn't. And it might be, just to put a positive spin on it, maybe one of the good things about marriage equality is it revealed that, right? And so now, if the movement is
Mhm.
going to continue, it's going to have to align itself with more systemic goals.
I actually, Lisa, you asked a question and it was revisited by Howell. It's the question about sociology and political science.
Mhm.
Keeps getting lost in the shuffle, like, and so could you, Lisa, ask that question one more time, what it was that you were asking?
Yeah. I might, maybe partly like I'm still figuring out what the question is, but it strikes me that there's something specific about being a political scientist. And I'm the first to critique the field and all of its boundaries, but to be like, to situate oneself in political science, studying social or political movements, whatever we call them, then there's something different about that than just being situated in sociology. And I don't want to overinflate a difference either, but there's maybe certain kinds of questions or sensibilities or other kinds of literature that people might be surrounded by. And in political science, the different ways that social research on social movements gets marginalized or not taught in a lot of different classes when people talk about political institutions. And then, so political scientists go to sociology a lot to think about social movements. So there's just something like, where is the home for social movements? I think in both, or social political movements, I think in both sociology and political science. I think it is, like Howell said, like a place where this is like a key overlap in the two fields. I think there's many others too.
Yeah.
But something about claim, I'm just curious about the claiming of, in the language of political movements, like what that does, what work that does that's different than social movements. I think Erin spoke to that around what calling them political movements does. I think that was partly my question. Yeah, how, but then is there, so partly I hear, Erin, in your answer, what it means, what it meant for you to claim that language. But then also maybe we could hear a little more of like the struggle or the debate, or that might give some of the texture of it. And what does it mean to call something a political movement in an academic landscape when people would brand everything a social movement? Or does it mean when you call it something that we're actually approaching it with some specific kinds of questions? So maybe it's actually the same thing. It is undocumented, it's dreamers, it's whatever it is, but then to, maybe in the way we name it, it might name some orientation about the kinds of questions we're asking.
Yeah.
Right. Erin, I think Howell has, he looks very animated. I think Howell wants to piggy. So
I think I just was really like, I loved kind of thinking through Lisa's question with them. Like I'm also very much in a muddy space on this question. So I think there is something, and we're definitely not going to solve it in the final minutes of it. But I do think that there is something different, or there are camps that are set up, whether or not we, traverse them, where we, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but there is something productive that is happening in the ways that politics, power, and social are delineated in these conversations that I think is productive of the research that gets done within those contexts.
right.
Yeah, that's all I was sort of thinking through.
Erin, you have exactly 1 minute to respond to this. And then two, I want to add to this, but I don't want to. And offline, I'll ask you the question of anthro, how ethnography is located in this thing.
Ethnography.
Oh, yeah.
In the next minute, could you please respond to how?
Well, I will agree. It's very muddy. And I do think that political movements have sort of been written out of the study of politics. You don't generally see them within Introduction to American Government classes,
Which
unless
is
you take
ridiculous.
unless you take mine. And then my whole interest groups class is actually about social movements. So I think Partially, I think we've created terminology to make things sound more sciencey and political science that have characterized things that are political movements as not political movements. And I think we haven't fully grappled with that yet. And that's maybe something we will need to do as a field. And I think that our students might actually be leading us there because they're so enmeshed in things like Black Lives Matter now.
Thank you. You did excellently. It's 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. So I think we all deserve a round of applause for each.
You too, Cyril. Thank you.
We do it this way. And all right, so how you can stop the recording now.